Hello, and welcome to my webinar on journaling for disaster recovery in InterBase. My name is Mary Kelly, and I am a software consultant slash InterBase enthusiast here at Embarcadero. I really enjoy answering questions relating to InterBase and the rest of the Embarcadero tools, so please reach out to me if you have any comments or questions at mary.kelly@embarcadero.com. On our agenda today, we're going to cover disaster recovery in InterBase and how to implement journals and journal archiving to keep your database safe when tragedy hits. We'll go over some tips for journaling and journal archiving with InterBase before jumping into our Q&A. Now, we all know that InterBase is a great database for a wide variety of industries. With its small footprint and its ability to be this powerful and reliable database that runs in a lot of different scenarios, we don't really think much about what happens when there are failures in our systems, whether it be hardware or software failure, a massive power outage or surge, a corruption in a database, or even external threats like malware. You need to have that plan in place to figure out how and what process you'll take to deal with that failure. We all have some understanding of what a disaster recovery plan actually is, but to reiterate, it's the belt of tools and procedures that you and your organization use to recover from a major disruption of your typical or normal operations. The plans themselves will be specific to your organization or industry's requirements for preventing data loss, so I can't really tell you the steps you need to follow, but there are some questions that you can ask yourself to figure out how to best configure your InterBase server for journaling and subsequently journal archiving. Now, DR plans often incorporate a lot of data specifics, such as recovery points, how long it will take to recover your normal operations, and things like making sure that the location for offsite backups or even the secondary physical server location is available and up and running at a moment's notice. But to really get an idea on the answers to these questions, you kind of need to know what the questions are in the first place. So things like what is the requirement for recovery time? Because we all know that every second counts. When your system fails, again, whether it be a hardware, software issue, it could be a cyber attack, it could have a devastating impact on your organization. And in the digital world as we know it today, those failures could lead to a supply chain operation imbalance and could financially impact your organization. So every second of that disruption or not knowing how long it could take to fix will count. Questions like how often should I back up my database? Or do I have other options available to me? Is a backup good enough for DR? Or do I need some other software out there? There are options that go beyond a backup and restore with journaling and journal archiving. For instance, you can archive an operational database that has a log of sorts of all the transactions in the database so that you can recover your system's data. How often should you review your disaster recovery plan or change it? And what kind of technology are you using in your disaster recovery plan? And is it efficient enough to prevent data loss and safeguard you from different kinds of disasters? So moving on to some of the options that you have available in InterBase for disaster recovery. With InterBase, we offer a hot backup or standby server that you can install and just leave off until the time you need to start the server up in the event that your server gets destroyed or gets taken offline for any reason. And with that, we also give you journaling and journal archiving. First, let's take a look at what journaling is and how to set up your journals before seeing how journal archiving can assist you in your recovery efforts. A journal consists of one or more journal files. Now, a journal file records each database transaction as it occurs. This makes a journal kind of an always up-to-date record of your database transactions. So, journaling is also sometimes referred to as write ahead logging, and it provides the security of immediately writing changes to disk with the benefits of a full in memory database system. Journaling can be enabled on a database through a single line of SQL and requires no changes in your application to have it enabled. So, how does this work exactly? Journaling turns off forced writes to the hard drive and synchronously writes the updates to the journal file instead in a sequential pattern, which allows for an improvement in your database's performance. You set up these checkpoints to automatically occur to save any changed pages in the database cache directly to your hard disk. These checkpoints specify the time at which InterBase must save all of those changed pages in the database cache to the database file. Now, journaling guarantees that all changes are on disk before a transaction is actually marked as committed, as long as the OS and hardware caching are disabled. While you don't necessarily need to use journal archiving to use journaling, it is recommended, as journal archiving lets you recover from a disaster that completely destroys the database server. To create a journal file and activate journaling, you're going to have to use the following DDL syntax that's listed here on the page. There are several parameters that you can also use, and we'll take a quick look at them. You'll create the journal with the journal name specification. So this is just going to be the full path and kind of base file name of the journal file. Now, if you don't specify the location for the journal file, then it's actually going to create the journals in the same folder as the database itself. So if you want to have some kind of separation, I recommend that you have a subfolder in the folder that holds the database file so that you can write within that folder. You have length, and this clause specifies the number of pages that can be written to the journal file before it has to roll over into a new journal file. Now, I think the default for this is about 4,000 pages, which is also the maximum, and you can change it at any point there.
We're going to quickly sidestep into determining journal rollover frequency. So, determining the most effective rollover frequency is going to be more important for a lot of use cases, and it's going to be different based on your specific InterBase installation. So this result will be placed as the length clause of the create journal statement. To determine the frequency in bytes, you're going to take the journal file length, multiply that by the journal page size, and that's going to equal the number of bytes before the rollover can occur. Then you can also determine the rollover interval by taking the page length, the journal file length times the journal page size, and then divide that by the journal page size times the number of writes per minute, and that's going to be the number of minutes between your rollovers. And then beyond that, if you need to calculate the journal length to give you the rollover interval, you can specify the rollover interval that you just calculated, multiply that by the database page size and the writes per minute, divide that by the journal page size, and that will give you your journal file length.
Checkpoint length, this is going to specify the number of pages that you can write to the journal file before a checkpoint occurs. The checkpoint interval, and this is going to determine the number of seconds between those checkpoints. If you have both a interval and a length for the checkpoints specified, whichever one occurs first is going to be initiated by the database checkpoint. And then page size, page cache determines the size of a journal page in bytes. Cache determines the number of pages that are cached to memory. So the default is around 100 buffers for the page cache, and the page size can be up to approximately twice the database page size. You can also choose to specify a timestamp name, and this will determine whether or not you want to append the file creation timestamp or if you want to go for the default, which is the year, month, date, hour, minutes, seconds, and then the sequence number dot journal. And pre-allocate just allows you to specify the disk space allocated for those journal files. Now let's take a quick look at how to create the journals and actually see what this looks like.
From IB Console, I'm currently connected to the DR Journals database that I've created. I can right-click on that database and go to Backup and Restore options, where all the way at the bottom I've got Create Journal. You can then specify all the options relating to your journal file that you want from here, and you can then go and create the journals. Now the journals will automatically populate into your folder where your database is listed unless you specify otherwise. So now that those files are there, we can see how to create them in iSQL. We'll drop this journal, and then from IB Console you can create journal and of course specify the options available that you need, and the files get automatically created from there. You can then go through and drop the journal under any circumstances that you need. Now let's take a look back at what you can do with journals and journal archiving next.
A journal archive is a directory that contains a full database dump and all of the journal files that have been completed since that dump. You can use the journal archive to then recover to the last transaction that's been recorded in the most recently archived journal file. Now, you can use the archived journal files to perform point-in-time recovery, and this point-in-time recovery uses that timestamp internally that's recorded on each of the transactions in the file, which allows you, if you so desire to recover to that specific date and time. Now, the purpose of journal archiving is to provide you with a more effective and efficient disaster recovery process, and as such, it enables you to recover to the last committed transaction in the most recently archived and completed journal file. So the best part about journal archiving, though, is that for disaster recovery purposes, the journal archive can be located on a different machine, ideally in a remote location than the one that houses the database server, and doesn't require that you have a server on that remote machine. So you can have a dedicated system that holds all of those journal archives completely separate from any machine that has InterBase installed, meaning they're always away from the server in the event of a potential crash and can let you bring a database back online with that point-in-time recovery. This also means that the up-to-moment recovery is actually possible if the hard drive where InterBase is installed that contains the current active unarchived journal file is actually still intact. Now, since only completed journal files are actually added to the archive directory on the remote machine, there is a potential downside, which is why we have to look at those checkpoints that we mentioned with journaling. Now, if a disaster wipes out the hard drive that contains an active, incomplete journal file, the data on that file or on that disk will be lost, which brings us to those questions that we asked earlier about how much time can you afford to lose. This will help to determine the checkpoints and the journal rollover frequency as well.
To set up your configuration for journals and journal archiving, you can kind of use this criteria to help you determine the optimal configuration for your system. So that's going to include things like the I/O speed of the device where your journal files are being created. So this is going to be the server itself. The speed of the concurrent creation of new journal files. Also the hardware requirements and the ease of setup for it as well. Now, one benefit is it's not necessary for InterBase to be installed and running on the machine that's being used for that journal archive storage. It can be a bonus, but it is not a necessity. Journal archives are also platform specific. So, for example, if you create an archive with InterBase for Windows, it cannot be directly used to recover an InterBase database on another platform. Instead, you would use the archived database dump to back up the database in a transportable format, and then you would restore that database on another platform. Now, there is a slight limitation. The number of items allowed to be archived will be limited by the number of files that are actually allowed in a directory for your given file system. For journal archiving, I created a folder called archive, which is where my journal archives will be held. Now, under normal circumstances, I would move this off my machine to some remote location, but in this case, for demo purposes, I will keep it on my machine. Now I can go right click, go to backup restore, and create the journal archive where it's already opened up to the path of the database, but I'll go ahead and expand that out to include the archive folder. Okay, and I'll also choose to archive the database. Now I can click OK. The archive has been completed, and the database has also been added to the archive. You can click OK on that. And now going into that archive folder, I can now see the database archive as well as the journal has also been included there. Now, one of my recommendations is to actually just go through the command and create a series of batch scripts so that you can create your journals and also create the journal archives and set a lot of the specific options, such as the dump count, so the number of journals that are allowed to be kept in each archive directory. You can use that with a gfix. And then also you can archive the entire database and archive those journals as well. You can set it up using the Windows Task Scheduler, and that will allow you to automate the process of those backups for your journal archiving.
So disaster strikes, the worst has happened, and your system's failed from some force. So what do you do? Well, you start off with your plans step by step until you get to data recovery.
Now, taking a look at what this looks like to recover the archived data dumps to the new destination database. Now, this could either be the database on the same machine if it's a software database corruption, or it could be a brand new machine set at a secondary location, either that standby backup database server or a brand new server. And you'll want to run a gback and then archive recover. You can use the until timestamp switch. Now, if you don't use this switch, the database is going to recover or attempt to recover and apply as many journal files that are possible to recover the database to the most recent point in time. So if it's possible, the database is going to attempt to recover files by jumping from the archive directory to the local journal directory to apply the journal files that haven't been copied to that archive. Now, again, that is specifically to a software database corruption rather than a hardware issue. So in that situation, it's even possible under some circumstances where the database can be recovered to the most recently committed transaction of the original database, allowing for even less data loss. You'll then add the archive database name as well as the new or recovered database name as well, before then setting the database to active for read and write transactions. So it will only be listed as a read only, so a gfix setting the mode to rewrite of that recovered database name will then let you activate that database for write permissions. Now, at this point, your database will not have any journals or journal archives listed anymore, so you'll want to start that process by setting it up again. You can create, again, that batch script that sets up the journaling, create journal archive, and then run that after a disaster recovery is successful.
Moving on to some tips and best practices for journaling and journal archiving. So the first tip I can tell you is to start building a new archive as soon as you have had a successful recovery of your database. You can create the new archive by issuing the gback archive database and archive journals commands, and this will start the process all over for you. Now, determining journal rollover frequency. Journal rollover frequency is a pretty time-consuming process. So if the rollover is happening too quickly, then performance can degrade over time. But if you're using journal archiving, then you kind of want those journals to roll over as often as possible so that you can complete the journal to be sent over for archival purposes, which would reduce the number of transactions that you'd actually lose during a disruption if it essentially destroys the server. I can tell you it's a bit of a balancing act to determine what's going to be best for your installation, but you can use those three equations that we mentioned earlier to figure out what might be the best value for you to use. Determining your checkpoint intervals. Now, if you recall, InterBase uses those checkpoint intervals to see how long it takes for InterBase to recover after a server crash. Now, say your server crashes, all of the changes that were in the cache are now lost. With journaling, remember, all of those changes were written synchronously to the journal. So they're not actually lost on disk, they're just lost to the database. So when the database restarts, it has to read through all of those journal files and copy those changes in the journal to a newly restarted database so it can get back on track. The more journal files you have, the longer it takes to restore. So figuring out what that checkpoint value is for your system is going to be a major bonus in getting you up and running in the most realistic time frame. Making sure that you pre-allocate journal space, and this is for kind of a best performance that you can get. Journal files should always be placed on a dedicated hard drive. And using this pre-allocate clause enables you to allocate space that's equal to the maximum number of journal files that will exist on your machine during normal operations. So this is also particularly useful if you don't have a dedicated drive, as this will actually guarantee that other files on the machine cannot use or consume the space that would be needed for those journals. One extra tip is to add in some extra space on top of that so that any journals that lose connection to your dedicated remote disk for archival can all be archived after the connection is gained back. And of course, the last tip I can give you is to practice your recoveries. Now, this is something probably everyone here has already thought about, but it tends to be the most important aspect to have down. Practice makes perfect, and testing or validation processes on your database recovery before a disaster can take place takes a lot of the guesswork out of how long it's going to take and what systems and what practices need to be followed to give you the most efficient plan for your business. Thank you again for joining this webinar on journaling for disaster recovery in InterBase. Now let's move into the Q&A.